I bought my little cabin in the woods as an escape from the constant noise of city life. It wasn't just a structure, it was a sanctuary I had poured my time, savings, and heart into. So imagine my shock when I discovered a realtor at my front porch one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, ready to tour the property. Apparently, my Homeowners Association had invited them, claiming the cabin was up for sale. No one had bothered to ask me, the actual owner, whether that was true. I escorted the bewildered realtor out, then immediately called the HOA. Their excuse? They thought I might be interested in selling, and they wanted to help facilitate. My blood boiled. That was when I realized if I didn't draw a firm boundary, they would keep acting like my cabin belonged to them. So I locked the front gate and posted my own handmade sign. Private property, not for sale. Trespassers will be reported. The next HOA meeting was tense. I stood up and explained that I loved my cabin and had no intention of selling. I reminded them loudly that my property is not theirs to market. To my surprise, a few other owners chimed in with similar stories. Turns out, the HOA had been pulling similar stunts for years. In the end, they backed off, but not before I made it clear that I would protect what was mine, legally and physically, no matter how much authority they thought they had.
Property rights are one of the most fundamental principles in society because they establish the boundary between what belongs to an individual and what belongs to others. When we talk about property rights in an educational sense, we are really talking about the balance of power, responsibility, and freedom. Owning property is more than just having a deed or a title. It is about having the ability to control, enjoy, and manage what is legally yours without undue interference. This becomes especially relevant in situations where homeowners associations, or HOAs, exist. HOAs are meant to provide structure and maintain neighborhood standards, but when they overstep their authority and behave as though they have ownership of private property, the lines blur in a way that undermines the very concept of individual ownership. When you purchase a home or a piece of land, you are not only investing money, but also claiming a space where your decisions are meant to carry the most weight. The law recognizes this through property rights, which give you exclusive control. This means you decide whether to sell, renovate, or simply keep the property as is. Nobody else, including an HOA, a realtor, or even a neighbor, has the power to dictate those decisions unless you consent, or unless there are clear legal restrictions in place. The problem arises when organizations assume ownership-like power without having legal title to the property. In the story of the cabin, the HOA inviting a realtor to tour and potentially market a property without the owner's consent directly undermined this principle. It sent a message, whether intentionally or not, that the association thought they had more say than the person who actually owned the land. Understanding property rights also requires understanding the historical and legal foundations behind them. In most legal systems, ownership is tied to certain core rights: the right to possess, the right to use, the right to exclude others, and the right to transfer ownership. These four elements combine to create full ownership. If even one of those rights is weakened by outside interference, the concept of ownership is threatened. In the cabin case, the right to exclude others was violated when the HOA arranged for a realtor to enter the property. Without consent, that act disregarded one of the most essential protections an owner has. This shows why property rights are not abstract principles. They directly impact daily life and the sense of security and control that comes with owning a home. There is also a psychological dimension to property rights. People do not buy homes merely for shelter. They buy them for stability, identity, and legacy. A cabin in the woods, for example, might represent peace, privacy, and personal achievement. If someone else assumes the right to market it as though it were for sale, they are not just intruding on financial property, but also on the personal meaning the place holds. Property rights protect that sense of ownership in both tangible and emotional terms. In an educational context, it is important to see property rights not as privileges granted by an HOA or community body, but as protections recognized by law. Homeowners associations may have bylaws and rules, but those documents do not override legal ownership. The association's power is typically limited to common areas and agreed-upon community guidelines, such as lawn maintenance or exterior paint colors. It never extends to selling or claiming ownership of an individual's home or cabin. Any attempt to do so is not only improper, but also dangerous, as it sets a precedent that weakens trust and erodes confidence in the very idea of private ownership. Respecting property rights is therefore essential for maintaining fairness, order, and personal freedom. When HOAs or other organizations ignore these boundaries, they do more than inconvenience people. They challenge one of the foundations of a free society. By insisting on those rights, by locking a gate or posting a sign, you are not just protecting your property, you're upholding a principle that benefits everyone. The lesson is clear. Property rights matter because they safeguard autonomy, prevent abuse of power, and remind every individual that what they have worked for, legally secured, and emotionally invested in is truly theirs to keep, to use, or to pass on.
Boundaries are one of the most important tools a person can use to maintain respect, safety, and control, especially when it comes to property. In everyday life, boundaries are the invisible lines that tell others what belongs to us, what we will tolerate, and what we expect in our interactions. On a physical level, boundaries might be fences, gates, or signs. On a social level, they might be clear communication, written agreements, or even just saying no. In both cases, boundaries exist to protect what is ours and to clarify where our authority begins and ends. When boundaries are not set or are ignored, misunderstandings arise, and in some cases, those misunderstandings turn into deliberate overreach. This is why the act of locking a gate or posting a sign may seem simple but carries profound meaning. It is a way of asserting control and sending a message that a line has been drawn and must be respected. When an HOA invited a realtor to tour a cabin without the owner's consent, the issue was not just about property rights in the legal sense, but also about the violation of personal boundaries. The cabin represented someone's private retreat, a space intentionally separated from the outside world. By arranging access without permission, the HOA crossed a boundary that was both physical and symbolic. In that moment, the owner's privacy and authority were disregarded. Restoring that boundary required a visible, decisive response, locking the gate and placing a sign. These actions may appear defensive, but they are actually proactive. They reinforce limits so others cannot pretend they didn't know where the line was. In an educational sense, boundaries serve as a form of communication. A locked gate is not just a physical obstacle, it is a message that access is restricted. A sign that says, "Not for sale," is not just a declaration of intent. It clarifies expectations so no one can misrepresent reality. Without boundaries, people may assume permissions that were never granted. With boundaries, there is little room for confusion. This is as true in communities as it is in individual relationships. Just as people need to set personal boundaries with friends or coworkers to avoid being taken advantage of, property owners need to set physical and legal boundaries with organizations like HOAs. The importance of boundaries also lies in their ability to prevent conflict before it escalates. In the cabin situation, if the owner had simply allowed the overstep to go unchecked, the HOA might have continued inviting realtors, creating even greater problems down the line. By responding immediately and firmly, the owner stopped a cycle before it could begin. Educationally, this demonstrates a principle often taught in conflict resolution. Early intervention through clear boundary setting prevents larger disputes later. It is always easier to reinforce a boundary the first time it is crossed than to repair the damage after repeated violations. There is also a broader community benefit to strong boundaries. When one property owner sets clear limits, it can encourage others to do the same. Neighbors who may have been quietly frustrated with an overreaching HOA can feel empowered to assert their own rights. Boundaries, in this sense, create ripple effects. They remind groups and individuals that authority has limits and that respect is non-negotiable. This is why in leadership and governance, boundaries are as important as rules. Rules may tell people what they can and cannot do, but boundaries reinforce who gets to make decisions in the first place. At their core, boundaries protect autonomy. They affirm that each person has the right to decide what happens in their space, with their time, and with their property. By locking the gate and posting a sign, the cabin owner did more than respond to a single incident. He or she reinforced a universal truth. Autonomy must be defended with visible, enforceable actions. Educationally, this lesson is invaluable. It teaches us that boundaries are not about being unfriendly or uncooperative. They are about ensuring fairness, respect, and security. When boundaries are respected, cooperation becomes easier because everyone knows where they stand. In the end, the importance of boundaries is not just about keeping people out. It is about protecting the right to choose who comes in, what happens next, and how one's own life and property are managed. Boundaries are statements of dignity. Without them, authority is eroded. But with them, individuals and communities can coexist in a way that balances freedom and respect.
Challenging abuse of power is an essential skill for both individuals and communities because unchecked authority often grows until it becomes oppressive. Abuse of power occurs when a person or organization exceeds the limits of their legitimate role and begins to act in ways that benefit themselves at the expense of others. In the case of a homeowners association, the board is typically given limited authority to manage shared spaces, enforce community rules, and maintain standards. However, when an HOA starts treating private property as if it falls under its direct control, it shifts from fulfilling its responsibilities to overstepping them. This is not just a minor annoyance. It is an abuse of power that undermines trust and erodes the purpose of community governance. Understanding why challenging abuse of power is necessary starts with recognizing how authority is supposed to work. Authority is not ownership. It is a temporary delegation of responsibility. For example, an HOA is authorized by its members to maintain common areas and enforce agreed-upon rules, but that does not mean it can decide when someone should sell their home or invite strangers onto private property. When authority holders blur this distinction, they move into abuse, whether intentionally or through negligence. If no one challenges them, this behavior becomes normalized. In the cabin story, the HOA's decision to invite a realtor without the owner's consent was a clear abuse. They acted as though they had decision-making power over something that was never theirs. One of the key reasons abuse of power must be challenged is that it rarely affects only one person. What happens to one homeowner today can happen to another tomorrow. If the cabin owner had accepted the HOA's interference, it would have set a dangerous precedent that the association could act as a de facto owner, deciding which properties should be marketed, toured, or managed without regard to the wishes of actual homeowners. By pushing back, the cabin owner was not just defending his own rights, but also protecting the entire community from future encroachments. This demonstrates an important civic lesson. Individual action against abuse strengthens collective freedom. Challenging abuse of power also reinforces accountability. Organizations like HOAs often operate with the assumption that most people will not push back because the process seems intimidating. Standing up, whether by locking a gate, posting a sign, or confronting the board at a meeting, disrupts that expectation.
It reminds those in authority that they are being watched and that their decisions are not beyond scrutiny. Accountability works as a check and balance system. Those who wield authority must always answer to those who grant it. Without accountability, authority easily drifts into control, and control into exploitation. Another educational point to consider is that challenging abuse of power does not always require hostility. It requires clarity, persistence, and sometimes public exposure. In the story of the cabin, the confrontation at the HOA meeting was not about shouting or aggression. It was about stating facts, pointing out overreach, and refusing to accept it. This demonstrates a practical way of handling abuse. Name the violation, set corrective actions, and insist on compliance. When done openly, others in the community often recognize their own grievances and rally together, which adds strength to the challenge. Abuse of power thrives in silence. It weakens when confronted with unity and transparency. In conclusion, challenging abuse of power is not about being rebellious for the sake of it. It is about preserving the rightful balance between authority and individual rights. When authority figures act as though they are above limits, they undermine the very foundation of trust that gives them their role in the first place. By recognizing abuse early, calling it out, and refusing to allow it to continue, individuals safeguard not only their own freedom, but also the health of the larger community. Abuse of power may always try to creep in, but as long as people are willing to challenge it, fairness and autonomy will stand strong.
Standing up for yourself is often seen as an individual act, but its effects ripple outward to strengthen the entire community. When one person refuses to be mistreated or overpowered, they set an example that others can follow. And this collective resistance helps prevent abuse from spreading. Communities thrive when individuals are willing to draw a line, not only for their own protection, but also to preserve the rights of their neighbors. This is why standing up against overreach is not selfish, it is a contribution to the larger good. In the cabin story, when the owner refused to allow the HOA to market their property without permission, the stand did more than safeguard one piece of land. It showed the entire neighborhood that the HOA's authority had limits, and that those limits must be respected. The act of standing up in a community context provides a sense of empowerment for others who may feel intimidated or unsure about voicing their concerns. Many people remain silent when faced with unfair treatment because they assume they are the only ones experiencing it. But once someone takes the first step, others often recognize they are not alone. In the HOA case, the cabin owner's bold move inspired other homeowners to admit they had experienced similar oversteps. This collective acknowledgement only became possible because one person was willing to challenge the status quo. Educationally, this demonstrates the power of leadership by example. A single act of courage can shift an entire group from passivity to awareness. Standing up also helps build accountability within community organizations. HOAs, like many governing bodies, often rely on compliance to maintain control. If no one challenges questionable actions, the board may assume its decisions are accepted and even welcome. However, when someone stands up publicly and firmly, the board is forced to explain itself, justify its decisions, and reconsider its actions. This process of accountability benefits everyone, not just the person who raised the concern. By demanding explanations and transparency, communities become more democratic, ensuring that authority remains answerable to the people it serves. Without these moments of standing up, authority can easily drift into unchecked control, creating resentment and division. Another important dimension of standing up for oneself in a community setting is the creation of trust. Communities function best when members believe their rights and boundaries will be respected. If they see that overreach goes unchallenged, trust erodes quickly, leaving people feeling isolated and powerless. But when one member demonstrates that boundaries can be defended, trust is rebuilt. Neighbors learn they are part of a group that values fairness and mutual respect.
In the cabin scenario, the owner's decision to lock the gate and post a sign signaled to others that they too had the power to assert their rights. Over time, such acts create a stronger, more resilient community where people feel safe and supported. From an educational standpoint, it is also worth noting that standing up does not mean being combative. It means being firm, clear, and consistent in protecting what is right. Effective community defense is not about aggression. It is about boundary setting, communication, and persistence. When individuals approach these situations with respect, but also with determination, they demonstrate that it is possible to stand up without creating unnecessary hostility. This sets a constructive tone for future conflicts, showing that disagreement can lead to positive change rather than division. Finally, standing up against overreach highlights the interconnectedness of individual and collective well-being. If one person loses their rights without protest, it weakens the security of everyone else. But if one person defends their rights openly, it strengthens the foundation on which everyone's rights rest. Communities are not just collections of houses. They are networks of shared expectations and protections. Each act of standing up reinforces those networks. The cabin story illustrates this beautifully. The owner's personal decision ended up protecting neighbors who might not have spoken up on their own. This is why courage in defending personal rights is always, in some way, a gift to the community. In conclusion, standing up protects more than just an individual's property or peace of mind. It safeguards the principles of fairness, accountability, and trust that allow communities to function. By showing others that boundaries can and should be enforced, individuals inspire collective strength and prevent abuses of power from becoming the norm. When one person defends their rights, they are in fact defending everyone's rights. That is why standing up is not just an act of self-preservation. It is an act of community preservation.